You never really know what kind of neighbor you have until the day a certified letter arrives, stamped with the cold authority of your local HOA. For most people, it's a minor annoyance, a reminder to trim your hedges or repaint your mailbox. But for my neighbor Tom, it was the beginning of a nightmare that would unravel his life, dollar by dollar, until the man I once knew as the block's most reliable handyman was left standing in the ruins of everything he'd built. This is the story of how a $10,000 fine, issued over a patch of wildflowers and a stubborn sense of pride, became the wrecking ball that tore through a family, a reputation, and a community's trust. It started, as these things often do, with something small. Tom and his wife Linda had lived next door to me for nearly a decade. Their house was the kind of place that made the rest of us look bad: fresh paint, a perfectly edged lawn, and a porch swing that creaked gently in the evening breeze. Tom was the guy you called when your garage door jammed or your gutters overflowed. He never asked for anything in return, just a cold beer and a few minutes of conversation. He was, in every sense, a good neighbor. But last spring, something changed. Linda was diagnosed with breast cancer, and suddenly, the house that had always been a model of suburban order began to show signs of neglect. The grass grew a little taller, the flower beds went unweeded, and the mailbox leaned at a tired angle. Most of us understood. We brought casseroles, offered to mow the lawn, and watched Tom's kids when he had to take Linda to chemo. But not everyone was so forgiving. Enter the HOA. Our association, Pinecrest Meadows, prided itself on maintaining community standards. That was the phrase they used in every newsletter, every meeting, every violation notice. It sounded reasonable enough, until you realized that community standards were enforced by a handful of people who seemed to have nothing better to do than patrol the neighborhood with clipboards and measuring tapes. The president, a woman named Cheryl, was the worst of them. She had a smile that never reached her eyes and a voice that could cut glass. If you left your trash can out 5 minutes past pickup, she'd know. If your shutters faded a shade lighter than approved colonial blue, you'd get a warning. So when Tom's front yard began to look less like a magazine cover and more like a patch of wild Ohio prairie, it was only a matter of time before Cheryl took notice. The first letter was polite, almost apologetic. Dear Mr. and Mrs. Jensen, we have noticed that your lawn exceeds the maximum height allowed by our community guidelines. Please address this issue within 7 days to avoid further action. Tom read it, sighed, and tossed it on the kitchen counter. He had bigger things to worry about. A week later, a second letter arrived. This one was less friendly. This is your final notice. Failure to comply will result in fines as outlined in Section 4.2 of the Pinecrest Meadows Covenants. Tom tried to explain. He really did. He called Cheryl, told her about Linda's treatments, about the kids, about how he just needed a little more time. Cheryl listened, made sympathetic noises, and then told him the rules were the rules. If we make an exception for you, we have to make an exception for everyone, she said, as if compassion were a limited resource. That's when Tom made his first mistake. Instead of cutting the grass, he doubled down. He let the wildflowers grow, arguing that they were good for the bees, that they added color to the block, that maybe, just maybe, the rules were wrong. He posted articles about pollinators on the neighborhood Facebook page, quoted city ordinances about native plants, and even put up a little sign that read, Certified Wildlife Habitat. Some of us cheered him on, tired of the endless pursuit of perfection. Others grumbled about property values and slippery slopes. The fines started small, $50 for the first week, $100 for the second. But Pinecrest Meadows had a policy. Unpaid fines accrued interest, and each new violation stacked on top of the last. By the end of the month, Tom owed $1,200. He tried to pay what he could, but with Linda's medical bills piling up, every dollar mattered. Cheryl was unmoved. If you can't afford to live here, maybe you should consider moving, she told him at the next board meeting, her voice echoing off the cinder-block walls of the community center. That was the moment the neighborhood began to fracture. Some people sided with Tom, arguing that the HOA was being heartless, that a little overgrown grass was nothing compared to what his family was going through. Others, led by Cheryl and her inner circle, insisted that rules were rules, and that letting Tom slide would set a dangerous precedent. The debate spilled over onto social media, into whispered conversations at the mailbox, and even into the local paper, where an anonymous letter to the editor accused Tom of lowering the tone of Pinecrest Meadows. Through it all, Tom tried to keep his head above water. He mowed the lawn when he could, trimmed the edges, and tried to make the yard look presentable. But every time he thought he was catching up, another letter arrived, another fine, another threat of legal action. The stress began to show. Tom lost weight, his hands shook, and the easy smile that had once been his trademark disappeared. Linda's condition worsened, and the kids grew quiet, their laughter replaced by the tense silence of a house under siege. By the time the total fines reached $10,000, Tom was out of options. The HOA placed a lien on his house, threatening foreclosure if he didn't pay. The bank, already nervous about missed mortgage payments, began sending its own letters. The neighbors who had once relied on Tom for help now avoided his gaze, afraid that siding with him would make them targets too. The man who had once been the heart of our block was now its cautionary tale. The day the lien notice arrived, Tom stood on his porch for nearly an hour, just staring at the envelope in his hands. I watched from my kitchen window, feeling helpless and angry. It was a bright Saturday morning, the kind that should have been spent grilling burgers or tossing a football with the kids. Instead, Tom looked like a man waiting for a storm to hit, shoulders hunched, eyes fixed on the ground. I walked over, coffee in hand, and tried to offer some comfort. "You know, Tom, if you need anything," I started, but he just shook his head. "Thanks, but I think I'm past the point where anyone can help." That was the first time I saw the cracks in his armor. Tom had always been the guy who fixed things, who found solutions. But now, the problem was bigger than a leaky faucet or a broken fence. It was a system designed to grind people down, to enforce conformity at any cost. The HOA wasn't just fining Tom for tall grass. They were making an example of him, a warning to anyone else who might think about challenging the rules. Linda's health continued to decline. The neighborhood, once a place of block parties and shared lawnmowers, grew tense and divided. Some neighbors left casseroles on Tom's porch, others crossed the street to avoid him. The Facebook group became a battleground, with posts and comments flying back and forth, some defending Tom, others calling him irresponsible. Cheryl, meanwhile, doubled down. She posted photos of Tom's yard, comparing it to properly maintained homes, and warned that property values are everyone's responsibility. One evening, after another round of heated online debate, Tom finally snapped. He posted a long, heartfelt message explaining everything: Linda's diagnosis, the medical bills, the sleepless nights. He begged for understanding, for a little grace. For a moment it seemed like the tide might turn. Dozens of neighbors commented with support, offering to help mow, to bring meals, to write letters to the board. But Cheryl and her allies were relentless. "We all have problems," one board member replied. "If we let emotions dictate policy, we'd have chaos." The next day, Tom's mailbox was egged. Someone spray-painted "lazy" on his driveway. The police were called, but nothing came of it. The message was clear: fall in line or face the consequences. Tom's kids started getting bullied at school. Linda, already frail, withdrew even further. The house that had once been a symbol of stability now felt like a fortress under siege. I tried to help where I could. I mowed Tom's lawn one morning before work, but Cheryl was there within the hour, snapping photos and making notes. "Third-party maintenance is not permitted without prior approval," she said, handing me a violation notice of my own. It was absurd, but it was also effective. The fear spread, and soon, even Tom's staunchest supporters began to distance themselves. No one wanted to be next. The legal threats escalated. The HOA's attorney sent letters threatening foreclosure, and the bank began the process of calling in the loan. Tom met with a lawyer, but the fees were astronomical. Every dollar spent fighting the HOA was a dollar not spent on Linda's care. The stress was unbearable. Tom started drinking more, and the once pristine house began to fall apart. The porch swing broke, the gutters sagged, and the wildflowers that had started it all withered in the summer heat. One afternoon, I found Tom sitting on his front steps, head in his hands. "I don't know what to do anymore," he said, voice barely above a whisper. I tried to do the right thing. I tried to stand up for what I thought was fair, but they just keep coming. I wanted to tell him it would be okay, that justice would prevail, but I couldn't. The truth was, the system was rigged. The HOA had the power, the money, and the legal muscle. Tom was just one man, fighting a machine that didn't care about his story. The foreclosure notice came in August. Tom had 30 days to pay the fines or lose his home. He tried to negotiate, to set up a payment plan, but Cheryl refused. "We can't make special arrangements," she said, her voice cold and final. "If we do it for you, we have to do it for everyone." The words echoed the same logic she'd used from the beginning. A logic that valued rules over people, order over compassion. The day the moving truck arrived, the neighborhood was eerily quiet. No one came to say goodbye, not even the people who had once called Tom a friend. I watched as he loaded the last of his belongings into the truck, his kids silent and withdrawn. Linda sat in the passenger seat, a blanket wrapped around her shoulders, staring out the window at the house they'd called home for 10 years. As the truck pulled away, I felt a wave of guilt and anger. We had all failed, Tom. We had let the rules matter more than the people they were supposed to protect. After Tom and his family left, the silence on our street was deafening. The house sat empty for weeks, a for sale sign staked in the front yard, the grass growing wild again, as if in silent protest. The wildflowers, once a symbol of Tom's stubborn hope, wilted and browned, trampled by real estate agents and prospective buyers who came and went, none staying long enough to see the story written in every cracked window and peeling shutter. The neighborhood felt different, colder, more suspicious. People who used to wave from their driveways now kept their heads down, afraid that any show of sympathy might draw the HOA's attention. Cheryl, meanwhile, seemed to grow bolder. With Tom gone, she turned her focus to other violations. A faded fence here, a basketball hoop left out overnight there. The letters kept coming, each one a reminder that in Pinecrest Meadows, perfection was mandatory and mercy was in short supply. The board meetings became tense affairs, with fewer and fewer residents willing to speak up. Those who did were quickly silenced by legal jargon and veiled threats. "We're just enforcing the rules," Cheryl would say, her smile as brittle as ever. "If you don't like it, maybe this isn't the right community for you." But beneath the surface, resentment simmered. The story of Tom's downfall spread, whispered in backyards and over fences, shared in hushed tones at the grocery store. Some neighbors blamed Tom for bringing trouble on himself, for refusing to just cut the grass and pay the fines. Others saw him as a martyr, a warning of what could happen to anyone who dared to challenge the system. The division was palpable, a crack running through the heart of our community. I found myself thinking about Tom more than I cared to admit. I missed our conversations, his easy laugh, the way he could fix anything with a few tools and a little ingenuity. I missed the sense of camaraderie that had once defined our block, replaced now by suspicion and fear. I wondered if I could have done more, if any of us could have. Maybe if we'd stood together, the HOA would have backed down. Maybe if we'd spoken up sooner, Cheryl wouldn't have felt so powerful. But regret, I learned, is a poor substitute for action. One evening, as I was taking out the trash, I noticed a new family moving into Tom's old house. They looked young, hopeful, the kind of people who still believed in the promise of suburban life. I wanted to warn them, to tell them about the hidden costs of living in Pinecrest Meadows, but I kept my mouth shut. Who was I to shatter their optimism? Maybe things would be different for them. Maybe the HOA would leave them alone. Or maybe in time they'd learn the same hard lessons Tom had. The months passed, and the neighborhood settled into a new, uneasy normal. The board continued its campaign of enforcement, and the rest of us learned to keep our heads down. But the memory of what happened to Tom lingered, a ghost haunting every block party and community event. It was a cautionary tale, a reminder that in Pinecrest Meadows, the rules were absolute, and the consequences for breaking them could be devastating. Then, one day, a letter arrived in my mailbox. It was from the HOA, of course, another violation notice, this time for a non-compliant mailbox color. I stared at the letter, anger rising in my chest. It was the same shade of blue it had always been, the same shade as half the mailboxes on the street. But I knew better than to argue. I repainted it that weekend, cursing under my breath, feeling the weight of the system pressing down on me. But something in me had changed. I started talking to my neighbors again, quietly at first, then more openly. We shared stories, compared violation notices, and realized that we were all living in fear of the same thing. The HOA wasn't protecting our community, it was controlling it, using the rules as a weapon to keep us in line. The more we talked, the angrier we became. The more we shared, the less alone we felt. It wasn't long before a small group of us began meeting in secret, gathering in living rooms and backyards to discuss what we could do. We researched the bylaws, looked into state laws, and reached out to other communities who had faced similar problems. We learned that we weren't powerless, that the HOA's authority wasn't absolute. There were ways to fight back, legal challenges, petitions, even the possibility of recalling the board. The process was slow, and the risks were real. Cheryl and her allies watched us closely, quick to pounce on any sign of dissent. But we were careful, methodical. We documented every violation, every threat, every instance of selective enforcement. We built a case, not just against Cheryl, but against the culture of fear that had taken root in Pinecrest Meadows. As the months went by, our group grew. More neighbors joined, emboldened by the knowledge that they weren't alone. We started to believe that change was possible, that we could reclaim our community from the grip of the HOA. It wouldn't be easy, and it wouldn't happen overnight. But for the first time since Tom left, I felt a glimmer of hope. The first real turning point came on a rainy Thursday evening, when our small group gathered in my living room, the air thick with anticipation and the scent of wet grass drifting in through the open window. We sat in a loose circle, me, Sarah from 2 doors down, the Millers from the corner, and old Mr. Patel, who'd lived in Pinecrest Meadows longer than anyone. We pored over printouts of the HOA bylaws, highlighters in hand, searching for loopholes and inconsistencies. Sarah's husband, a paralegal, explained how the board's authority was not as ironclad as they wanted us to believe. They count on us not knowing our rights, he said, tapping a section about due process. But if we organize, if we document everything, we can push back. It was empowering, sitting there together, realizing that the fear we'd all felt was not inevitable. We made a plan, start a petition to recall Cheryl and her closest allies, gather signatures and demand a special meeting. We knew it would be an uphill battle. The board had years of experience, a network of loyal supporters, and a knack for intimidating anyone who stepped out of line. But we also knew that the only way to change things was to stand together. The next few weeks were a blur of late-night meetings, whispered conversations, and careful strategizing. We divided up the neighborhood, each of us responsible for talking to a handful of neighbors, sharing our story, and asking for their support. Some were hesitant, afraid of retaliation. Others were eager, their own grievances bubbling to the surface. The more we talked, the more we realized just how many people had been hurt by the HOA's heavy-handed tactics. Fines for minor infractions, threats of foreclosure, public shaming at board meetings, it was a pattern, not an exception. We collected stories, documented evidence, and built a coalition. The petition grew, signature by signature, until we had enough to force a special meeting. Cheryl tried to block us, of course. She sent out letters warning of outside agitators and malicious intent. She called emergency board meetings, tried to change the rules, even threatened legal action. But this time the community was ready. We showed up in force, filling the community center to capacity, our petition in hand and our voices united. The meeting was tense, the air crackling with anticipation. Cheryl sat at the front of the room, flanked by her allies, her expression a mask of confidence that didn't quite hide the fear in her eyes. One by one, neighbors stood up to speak. They told their stories, about fines that never seemed to end, about sleepless nights spent worrying over letters and threats, about the sense of isolation and helplessness that had taken root in our community. For the first time, Cheryl had to listen. For the first time, she saw the consequences of her actions reflected in the faces of the people she was supposed to serve. When it came time to vote, the result was overwhelming. Cheryl and 2 board members were recalled, replaced by neighbors who promised transparency, compassion, and a commitment to rebuilding trust. The room erupted in applause, relief and hope mingling in the air. It wasn't just a victory for our group, it was a victory for everyone who had ever felt powerless in the face of an unfeeling system. In the weeks that followed, the atmosphere in Pinecrest Meadows began to change. The new board suspended all pending fines, launched a review of past enforcement actions, and invited residents to participate in rewriting the bylaws. For the first time in years, people felt like their voices mattered. Block parties returned, kids played in the street without fear of reprimand, and neighbors who had once avoided each other now stopped to chat and share a laugh. But the scars of what happened to Tom remained. His story became a rallying cry, a reminder of what could happen when rules are valued above people, when compassion is replaced by control. The new board reached out to Tom, offering an apology and a promise to do better. They even set up a fund to help families facing hardship, so that no one else would have to choose between paying a fine and caring for a loved one. I called Tom, hoping to share the news, to let him know that his struggle had not been in vain. He was living in a small apartment across town, working 2 jobs to make ends meet. Linda's health had stabilized, but the ordeal had taken its toll. "I'm glad things are better," he said, his voice tired but sincere. "But I wish it hadn't come at such a cost. I promised to keep in touch, to visit when I could." We both knew that some wounds take longer to heal than others. As the months passed, Pinecrest Meadows slowly rebuilt its sense of community. The new board kept its promises, and the culture of fear began to fade. People started helping each other again, not because they were told to, but because they wanted to. The wildflowers returned, this time planted intentionally in a community garden, a living tribute to Tom and Linda's resilience. The transformation of Pinecrest Meadows didn't happen overnight, and it certainly wasn't perfect. There were setbacks, moments when old habits threatened to creep back in, and times when the wounds of the past felt too raw to ignore. But something fundamental had shifted. The story of Tom's $10,000 fine and the devastation it brought to his family had become more than just a cautionary tale. It was a catalyst, a shared memory that bound us together in a new way. We had seen what could happen when rules were enforced without empathy, and we were determined never to let it happen again. The new board, led by Sarah and Mr. Patel, made transparency their top priority. Every meeting was open to all residents, and minutes were posted online for everyone to see. They invited feedback, encouraged debate, and made it clear that the HOA existed to serve the community, not the other way around. The first order of business was to review every outstanding fine and violation. They found dozens of cases where the punishment far outweighed the offense. Mailboxes that were a shade off, lawns that had grown a little too long during a family emergency, fences that needed a fresh coat of paint. In each case, the board reached out to the homeowners, listened to their stories, and worked with them to find reasonable solutions. The atmosphere in the neighborhood began to thaw. People who had once lived in fear of the next violation notice now felt empowered to speak up, to ask questions, to get involved. The community garden flourished, tended by volunteers who remembered Tom's wildflowers and wanted to keep his spirit alive. Kids rode their bikes down the street, their laughter echoing off the houses, and neighbors lingered on their porches long after sunset, sharing stories and plans for the future. But the memory of what happened to Tom was never far from our minds. The board established a hardship fund, seeded with donations from residents and a portion of the recovered fines to help families facing unexpected challenges. They created a committee to review the bylaws, inviting input from everyone in the community. The goal was simple: to ensure that the rules protected property values without sacrificing compassion or common sense. I found myself more involved than ever before, attending meetings, volunteering in the garden, and reaching out to new families as they moved in. I made it a point to tell them Tom's story, not to scare them, but to remind them that this was a community that had learned from its mistakes. I wanted them to know that their voices mattered, that they were part of something bigger than themselves. One evening, as I was watering the wildflowers in the community garden, I saw Tom walking down the sidewalk, Linda by his side. They looked older, a little more worn, but there was a lightness in their step that I hadn't seen in years. We hugged, awkward at first, then with genuine warmth. "It's good to see you," I said, and I meant it. Tom looked around, taking in the changes, the garden, the kids playing, the neighbors chatting on their porches. "You did it," he said quietly. "You turned this place around." I shook my head. "We all did." "You started it, Tom. You showed us what happens when we forget to care about each other." Linda smiled, her eyes shining. "It's beautiful," she said, reaching down to touch a cluster of purple coneflowers. "Thank you for remembering." We sat on a bench, watching the sun set over Pinecrest Meadows. Tom told me about his new job, about the apartment they'd made into a home, about the small victories and the hard days. He didn't sugarcoat the pain, the loss, or the anger he still felt. But he also spoke of hope, of forgiveness, of the possibility that even the worst experiences could lead to something better. As darkness fell, neighbors drifted over to say hello, to welcome Tom and Linda back, even if just for a visit. There were apologies, some awkward, some heartfelt. There were promises to do better, to look out for one another, to never let the past repeat itself. It wasn't a perfect ending. There were still scars, still regrets. But it was a beginning. The story of Tom's $10,000 fine became a legend in Pinecrest Meadows, told to every new resident, shared at every board meeting, and remembered every time someone suggested a new rule or a stricter policy. It was a reminder that communities are built on people, not just property values. On compassion, not just compliance. It was a lesson learned the hard way, but one that would shape our neighborhood for years to come.